Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Resilience to Navigate Change. We are thrilled for all of you to be able to join us. I know a number of you are still joining as we speak, but I'll go through a little bit of logistics as we get started. My name is Karen Wood. I'm a marketing leader here at Infopro Learning, and we're the sponsor of this program. Just a couple of words about Infopro. Not familiar, we are a full-service learning and development partner offering a full range of services, including award-winning custom e-learning, video, instructor-led programs, and blended learning journeys. And we also offer flexible staffing solutions to help augment your own learning and development teams when they are needed. So I'm going to go through a few points of etiquette as we did. For one thing, you will be on mute throughout the session. However, we definitely encourage you to make this as interactive as possible. So please take advantage of the chat and Q&A functions of GoToWebinar, and then we will address all of your questions at the end of the webinar. We will also be providing slides after the fact and the recording as well. Feel free to download the participant handout as well via the chat channel. So I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers now. I'd like to start by introducing the facilitator, Dan Rust. Dan is a best-selling author and a speaker focusing on workplace culture and leadership development. He's the Vice President of Global Leadership Development for Infopro. So Dan and I work closely together. And Dan works with a team of researchers, developers, and instructional designers who focus exclusively on the leadership space. Now, I'll let Dan say a few comments about himself, but he and his team work with hundreds of client organizations, including some of the clients that we have here on the call today. And the leadership program that Dan manages offers off-the-shelf leadership programs for emerging leaders, mid-career professionals, and senior executives. Well, I will go ahead and keep my section brief and turn things over to Dan. And Dan, you can introduce the rest of the panelists. Over to you, Dan.
Happy to do that. So throughout my typical week, I get a chance to meet with leaders throughout with organizations throughout the world. And who we have with us today are two of the leaders that I've worked with in the past who have been particularly, number one, great to work with, but also have great examples of change management, change challenges that they've had to navigate in their own organizations and in their own careers. I'm going to give you a little overview of each of them, and then Melissa, Kevin, if there's anything else that you want to share about yourselves, you're certainly welcome to. Melissa Chambliss is the Chief Human Resources Officer for StandardAero. Prior to StandardAero, she was with GE Aviation and GE in general for many, many years. StandardAero is one of the aerospace industry's largest independent maintenance, repair, and overhaul providers, MRO providers. They have over 7,500 employees in over 50 major facilities across the globe. If you have flown pretty much anywhere to anywhere, most likely StandardAero has been part of maintaining the aircraft that you flew in at one time or another. So be nice to Melissa. You don't want to go on her list. Kevin is the Senior Manager of Training and Development for Power Engineers. And prior to this, Kevin served as a Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force for over 20 years. So thank you, Kevin, for your service. Power Engineers is a global consulting and engineering firm. They do engineering, architecture, general program management with over 4,000 employees in 45 offices across North America. They work on a lot of really interesting things with lots of complexities within all of those various projects. So with that, I'll pause for a second. Melissa, Kevin, no pressure, but if there's anything else you want to share about yourselves before we kick into gear, certainly happy to have you do so.
Well, I will just throw out the disclaimer. I do not repair the actual engines. So, and I don't think anyone would want me to repair the actual engines, but we hire a lot of great technicians and employees that are very skilled at repairing those engines. So you're in safe hands with StandardAero repairing and overhauling your aircraft engines. So.
Excellent.
Yeah, Dan, nothing really from me except thanks for the invite. I look forward to the conversation.
All righty. Then as we were preparing this and putting this together, I did a quick search on Amazon just to see how many books and other resources are available related to change management. And you can see I came up with over 50,000 results. So I mean, tons and tons of content related to change management. And we didn't necessarily want to just be another change management webinar. We wanted to have a dose of reality with this webinar. So we're going to share examples, we're going to share stories, we're going to share general thoughts and ideas, and try and make it as practical as possible. I do want to put in a shameless plug for 2 of our Infopros change related programs. And in fact, some of the content you're going to see in the webinar is sampled from these 2 programs. We have a program called the Change Acceleration Process, which is designed to help organizations drive change throughout the organization. And then we have a program called Resilience to Navigate Change, which is more about the personal capabilities to help individuals navigate whatever change is happening to them, whether it's corporate change or life change or change in general. I did come across this quote years ago that I just always have referenced, because the essence of this quote is that change is happening, it's going to happen, it's always happening, and whether it's life or business, change becomes a constant. And so the degree to which any of us enhances our ability to navigate change, it's going to have impact on virtually every area of our life. And the degree to which we are constrained, if we find ourselves with an inability to flex and respond and navigate change, it is going to be one of those things that it just becomes a constant weight on us, because the world around us is evolving, is changing constantly. And as we were looking at some results from employee surveys, and these were surveys done of employees of companies where there had been major change initiatives that had quote unquote failed. Essentially, we defined failure as a change initiative that didn't achieve its intended result. And here were the 3 most common complaints, and I think these will ring true for all of us. They didn't think it through all the way. Many of the employees in this survey, in their anecdotal comments, said it was clear that whoever was driving the change initiative hadn't really thought through all of the what ifs, or when this happens, then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. We also saw a lot of comments related to they didn't necessarily explain why the change was necessary, what was driving the change. The change was just sort of landed upon us without any context. And then finally, they waited until the last minute. And in some of the comments, what the employees were saying is they waited until it was too late. The change itself was probably the right change and would have made a difference 6 months ago or 10 months ago or whatever. But so it was just interesting that these were the most common employee responses to change initiatives that ultimately didn't produce the intended outcome. And so I thought a way to kick us off, Melissa and Kevin, is just to ask you, in your careers, do you have any examples? And you don't have to reveal too much. I mean, you can reveal names if you want to. You can be as you know, you can be as revelatory as you want to, or as closed off as you want to. But just any examples of major mistakes or errors, either by individuals or organizations, in their efforts to drive really any kind of change. Does anything occur to you or bubble up in your mind?
So, I mean, for me, you know, I've been with GE, in and out of GE for a long time. And I guess, you know, the companies I've been with, I've been bought or sold, depending on how you look at it, 6 times in my career. And what I can say is oftentimes we underestimate the amount of communication and the depth of communication that's needed when you're changing. And integration into different companies brings a ton of change. And I think a lot of times leaders, they have thought about the change for a long time, so they're acclimated to the change. They understand why we're doing the change, but then they forget to fully communicate the who, what, why, where, how, when. That's my template for every communication that, you know, I want to put together is who, what, why, when, where, how. So that you fully explain what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it. And I think oftentimes we miss those gaps because as leaders, we've been talking about a change maybe for 3 months. We get more comfortable with it. And then we expect immediately that our employees are okay with the change. But you've had time to adjust, and you have to give employees time to adjust too and fully communicate that. That's just one thing that comes to mind.
You know, just building on that, Melissa, then I think what some organizations do is they decide, okay, we do have to communicate this, so they put out a detailed email or a detailed video, or they do some kind of communication once. So while they've had months to talk, to discuss, to question, to internalize, and then at some point all of that internalization, they produce a communication and out it goes. And then they're shocked that it seems like people don't get it, or they don't agree, or they're not buying in, or they're still acting as if this hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So you're right. And I think, you know, we definitely underestimate the amount of repetition and reinforcement required for an entire organization to internalize whatever the change initiative might be.
Right.
Anything come to mind for you, Kevin?
Yeah, a couple things. You know, as I sort of reflect on this, I think stakeholders at times can sort of have an unrealistic expectation around change management and what change managers and that science can bring to it. And your stat, Dan, earlier about 80-some% being dissatisfied, I think that's telling. I mean, there's only so many what ifs you can solve for in a fast-paced, you know, a dynamic environment. So I'm a believer in change management, and it wasn't, you know, this was not a common term. Even 10 years ago, it seems like it's new. I know the science has been around for some time, but there are a lot of people maybe on the leadership teams who might nod their head up and down. They understand what change management is, but I don't think they really do. And I think some time has to be spent up front in a project or in some other change management effort to sort of level set what expectations are. One of the things that stands out for me is, for some people, training is 100% change management. Hey, we got these 2 great online courses. We're going to force everybody to take them by the end of March. Change management, done, right? And it doesn't work that way. It's, you know, it's a team effort. And yes, the training teams are involved, but leadership and stakeholders and others are involved for this to be successful. And I know you're going to get this in a minute, Dan, into this concept, but I think the emotional part, the change is very difficult. And especially as we start stacking change on change on change, you know, think of the audience and your employees, what they're having to deal with. And I think we lose sight of that sort of human factor in all of this and addressing that. And I think the story and the context, Melissa, that you were sort of touching on really helps sort of mitigate that. It doesn't eliminate it, but it can, if we get the big picture, it really helps.
Yeah. Well, and something you said sparked a thought around, you know, the planning of the change, right? Oftentimes leaders will go off and won't have the right diverse group of employees be a part of implementing that change or designing that change. And that goes back to the first statistic, I think, where, you know, they didn't fully think this through, right? Sometimes as leaders, we don't have all the nuances and details. And so if you don't surround yourself with a very diverse team with different experiences and different, you know, aspects of whatever change that you're doing, whether it be a system change or something like that, errors and mistakes may be made. And I think having that team surrounding a project is going to be very critical also, so that you get it right, or as right as you can. Change is usually not 100% correct the first time. So
And Melissa, you whatever group of people you pull in to be part of the dialogue, even if it's true that none of them has actual control, maybe a few of them do, but even if, let's say, you pull in a small group of people and they are part of the conversation, they're part of the give and take, they're part of the discussion, every one of those individuals feels a certain sense of ownership and control, like I was part of this. And that's very different than the vast majority of the organization to whom this is now delivered as, here's what we're going to do. Even if you fully explain, here's why we're doing it, here's the compelling reason that we're doing it, it still, for the majority, feels like this has happened to us because we weren't part of the dialogue. And I realize you can't bring everyone into the dialogue and discussion, but you probably do need to be more sensitive to the fact that, okay, we're landing this on people now. And so we do need to put more effort into the why, all of the questions that you mentioned. More effort needs to be put into that, because this is landing on them as opposed to them being a part of it.
Yeah, it's funny, Dan. I tell managers and leaders all the time in coaching sessions that people will do a lot of things with you, but they don't like it when you do things to them, right? And so that sense of collaboration is critical.
About 20 years ago, I worked for a business where many of the employees were getting indications that a big change was about to occur. But the message from senior leadership was, no, ignore the drum beats in the distance, ignore your lying eyes and ears. No change is going to happen. Nothing. And then, of course, the day comes and dramatic change occurred, and about maybe a third of the employee base was no longer there. And what that particular senior leadership team failed to think through was the impact that had on the remaining 2/3 of the employees, because no question they had been lied to, no question. So now the assumption of the senior leadership was, well, now that you 2/3, you're here. So now we're going to move on because you're a survivor. Well, unexpectedly to them, about 10% of those survivors were gone within 3 to 4 months, because people felt like I can't trust what's being said. And so some of the key people that were intended to remain, in fact, moved on, found other opportunities. And some of those people were critical to the change initiative. So then the change initiative itself began to crumble. So I think it's another example of leaders not really thinking through, like thinking the chess game 2, 3, 4, 10 steps ahead, and instead just looking, one step by step.
Dan, can I just chime in on that too? I think it's the downstream impact of that decision to sort of mislead the employees that's something that's going to cost that firm time and time again in the coming months, in the coming years, because there's been a breach of faith there. So just fast forward in 12 months, we have another big change initiative. Are they going to believe, the stuff that's coming out of the mouths of the higher ups? I think so it has a huge impact, obviously, at the moment. But like you said, that second, third order of effect is a big deal.
Yeah, and that leadership team will never regain their credibility.
And I was one of the 10% who, after the layoffs, I chose to move on, but I maintained friendships with a number of people. Easily 10 years later, the effect was still there. And you're right, until there was over time a complete changeover in the leadership team. But even after that, it was like the legacy, the echo of that still reverberated without a doubt. There's a concept called the sigmoid curve, and the essence of this concept is that organizations most of the time go through change initiatives after some major disruption to their business. So if you look at the sigmoid curve on the left-hand side, that downward initial curve is meant to indicate a lack of success or some degree of failure or challenges in the business that drives some level of change. And then as the change is driven and the company or business gets onto a success plan or a success track, they'll go on to be successful, and most likely just keep doing what they're doing, because if it isn't broke, don't fix it. They just keep doing what they're doing until there's the next downward turn, then the next shift in the market, the next shift in consumer trends, or the next shift in something, and then they wait until it produces a negative effect on their business before having another change initiative driven by the lack of success or the downturn. But what you see in most consistently successful companies that are consistent decade after decade after decade is they start to drive change when they're still feeling successful. They don't wait until you're starting to feel those rumblings of drum beats in the distance. They look around corners, they look into the future, and they're constantly evolving and changing in advance, so they never experience that downturn. The challenge that whole sigmoid curve concept creates for us is that you do have the highest probability of success if you're changing while you're still successful. You have more resources, you have more flexibility, you have more time, you have more financial capabilities if you're building your change while you're still experiencing success. But that's exactly when change support tends to be at its lowest, because nothing is obvious. There's no burning bridge that says, hey, we must go from here to here. Of course, that's what leadership is supposed to do. Leadership is supposed to look into the distance, see what's going to be happening, and find ways to communicate to the employees, here's why we're changing, here's why we're evolving to avoid that downturn. Because if you wait too long, the support may be stronger because we're experiencing the panic, but your chance for success is lower because you have fewer resources. Does that strike a bell or ring a bell for either of you in terms of have you seen organizations in the past essentially wait too long to drive something that was ultimately needed?
Yeah, for me, Dan, as I was thinking about this, I don't have a grand story of waiting too long. I think my experience in the military, financial services, has shown that I think some of these threats to the company comes in on cat's paws, right? It's quiet. So as you mentioned, as workloads pick up, we have higher workloads, we have departures of key staff members, but we try to maintain sort of this rhythm that we're used to, that we've been doing for 5, 6, 7 years, fill in the blank, but it doesn't work anymore. And then I think what you run into here is the people on the front lines will adjust. They'll make it happen, but expectations and guidelines of what's really happening maybe on the front lines start to do this, or really start to depart, right? And that's a dangerous situation because they're not meeting. It could be regulatory issues. It could be simply company guidelines, policies, things of that sort. So when I think about this, I just think of that creep away from standard into, hey, we just got to get it done. We feel the time pressure. We feel the quota pressure. And now this is where I think a change management effort can come in and look at, okay, let's get this realigned. Let's think through this and make the adjustments.
I do think this is where exceptional leaders do separate themselves from average leaders. Exceptional leaders, number one, they are so tapped into their employees, their market, their business in general, that they do hear the very faint, distant drum beats. They do see around corners, and they do have a sense of something in the future that maybe not everyone else sees. Because as a leader, if you're just seeing exactly what everyone else sees, well, then you're going to be doing what everyone else does. You're going to be reacting in the way that everyone else reacts. So, and it's not easy. That's what leadership is supposed to be. Ideally, is we want to follow people who see something that we don't all see, who are to some degree smarter, more aware, more brave, more of something than we are. But it's a tough challenge, because having the bravery to say, all right, I think I get where this is going. I think I see something in the distance. I don't have absolute proof. I can't just lay it in front of you and say, this is absolutely going to happen. But at the same time, I want to be a visionary. I'm going to have some degree of confidence and faith. I'm going to lead us in a particular direction. You had mentioned, Kevin, go ahead, Melissa.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the examples I have being in human resources, right? I focus a lot on the talent of the organization and what talent is needed when and where in the organization to drive the initiatives or whatever it is that the business is doing. And one of the things that I find that leaders wait too late for oftentimes is when they have poor talent or talent that needs a bigger person in the role or a change management leader in a role, they wait too long oftentimes to make those changes because it's uncomfortable, right? You may have to negatively impact someone. You may end up having to exit someone from the organization or bring someone in new. And as humans, we have a tendency to avoid pain or avoid uncomfortable situations that cause us pain. And so I see oftentimes that leaders wait too late. In order for us to be successful, you have to have the right talent. And as a business grows, sometimes the business grows faster than the talent within the organization. And that's something that I find that oftentimes leaders and in general, people will wait too late. You underestimate the amount of time it takes to find the right talent. If you're setting up a new program, a new product introduction, you have to oftentimes hire someone 6 months before that to train them. So, there's this whole progress of time, and oftentimes people can wait too late for that change initiative.
You bring up such a huge point. I'm going to back up here for a second. When you think about the sigmoid curve in terms of our talent, we've all experienced situations where someone was a strong performer for a period of time, and then things change. Either they change, or the market changes, or the business changes, or something else evolves and changes, and for whatever reason, they're not the ideal or optimal fit for the role. And I've seen many leaders try to build positions around their existing talent. Like, okay, he's not really optimal in this role anymore. Let's shift responsibilities to optimize for him. And that, to your point, that's a desire to avoid the pain of change, because you don't want to be building positions around people. You want to build positions because that's what the business needs, and then identify the right people for those positions. But I think you're dead on when it comes to the delay. One of the questions I ask we have a program on organizational culture and hiring decisions. And one of the questions I will ask is, how many of you in the room, and these are typically senior leaders in the room, how many of you have someone in your organization that if they came to you today and they said, thanks for the opportunity, it's been great, I've decided to move on, and I'll be leaving in a week or 2 weeks or whenever. How many of you have someone like that, where if that occurred, you actually would feel a sense of relief, like, okay, now I have an opportunity to optimize the person in that role? Everybody raises their hand that they've had someone like that. And then I ask, how long did it take? Like, when you had that realization, how long did it take for you to make the change? And there's always at least a few people who say, well, I actually haven't done it yet. So they're still in that position. And usually, once they do make whatever change they make, they come to a realization what that suboptimal individual had cost the organization over a period of time. It's oftentimes a lot more than you think, because you've been hanging on for so long.
But that goes to having, from a leadership perspective, you have to have the courage to face into those uncomfortable discussions and those uncomfortable situations and change management. And that's what your team is looking to you to do also, right? Yes. Because not only do you know that person is not a right fit for the job, or not performing, or the organizational structure is not what we need, so do all your employees, by the way. and they're looking at you as the leader, as the person who's supposed to be putting this in place, and you're not doing so, which is, from a leadership perspective, damaging your credibility also. And I think people lose sight of that, you're trying to be nice, but it's really not a good reflection on your leadership profile.
And then when it puts a crack in the armor of your credibility on that issue, whether it's fair or not, it impacts everything else as well. People start to wonder, well, if that's the quality of the thinking in this, what's the quality of the thinking in whatever else?
Exactly.
Kevin, when we earlier on, you had talked a bit about the emotional response to change, and I pulled this slide from our program on change resilience, but I actually don't think it's totally accurate, because in my experience, people don't go through like these phases smoothly. It's more like shock, frustration, denial, shock, experiment, shock, depression, shock, denial. Shock. It's like back, bam, 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 and it doesn't take much to trigger back into frustration or back into denial. But no matter what, it's an emotional experience, particularly for the people who feel like the change has been thrust upon them, as opposed to the change. These phases were derived from, I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, but the big distinction is that her model was around like reaction to death, and death is an event. It's like a one-time event, and it's non-negotiable. It's happened, as opposed to organizational change, which tends to be not just a one-time distinct event that's not negotiable. You have, lots of people hoping that we can negotiate our way, back to the past or in other ways. But when it comes to that personal resilience, you all know, and you yourselves reflect the mindset of people who have navigated change effectively. And it's not so much the actions as it is the mindset or what's happening in people's heads that helps them navigate effectively. And so I guess I wanted to see what thoughts you might share just regarding either your own mindset related to change, your own mental process related to change, or what you've seen in others who have been able to navigate change effectively. Malisa, I know at GE, for people to survive, GE was a constant change environment. It continues to be a constant change environment. So you're either going to develop those mental capabilities, or it's just not going to work out for you. But any thoughts on like the mental resilience required to navigate corporate change?
Yeah, so it's so funny you mentioned GE, because we would always laugh, if you don't like this organizational structure, just give it a couple of years, it'll change, right? So, it was always changing. And, one of the things I'll say, I think I mentioned it earlier, companies I've been with have either been bought or sold 6 times. And I've watched some people masterfully, navigate that change and be very successful on the other side of an integration and that kind of thing. And I was fortunate enough myself that almost every single time I ended up getting promoted, right? And when I think about the people who didn't make that change very well, they were so focused on the things that they could not control, that they were trying their best to control things that were outside of their control, instead of focusing on what they could control, which is themselves, their behavior, their work product, their efforts in the work product. And they would get so stressed out about all of the things happening that were outside of their control that they were stressed out. We know that humans, when we're stressed, our bad behavior comes out, right? And we all have that bad behavior. And because of that, very successful, very smart people would end up not making it, right? They would either self-select themselves out because they just couldn't handle the lack of control, or they would be chosen to exit, right? Because of the bad behaviors and the lack of performance, because they were too busy focusing on something else.
Have you had any success in coaching somebody to adjust their mindset? Because honestly, I've struggled with that. I remember I had a colleague, and I sat down with him and I said, look, so stuff is happening. You can focus in on what you can't control, or you can focus on what you can control. You can focus on what you do have. You can focus on the current state. And all he said, I remember it because he snapped back at me. He said, stop trying to Tony Robbins me. And then basically he went right back to his, his old thinking. So do you have any, I don't know, any guidance on how do you help somebody shift their own mindset?
Yeah, Dan, I'd say try to give them some perspective. This is not the only change effort that's happened in history where there's been, I'll say, some tactical issues. And like Melissa was saying, if you get drawn into these very sort of narrowly focused things that you can't change and you fixate on that, of course you're going to be dissatisfied as this goes. But I think a little optimism here goes a long way. We know what I'll say to folks is, hey, we know there's going to be some broken glass after implementation on November 1st of 2023. We know that. Okay, we're going to come back to it. And I'll say, I would coach a person, hey, remember when we did X, or they may not have been here 2 years ago and we did Y, but try to pull that perspective in a little bit. We're not attacking your comfort level. This change management effort was not at you. It's going to take a little time to shake out. Please allow some grace. And I know that can be hard. Again, these are emotional topics sometimes, but I think that pull back, a little perspective can help calm folks down and at least in their mind, buy them a little time to give this a chance, or a chance to be fixed, or a chance for their concerns to be heard.
Melissa, I think you're on mute now.
Sorry, my Jabra speaker just decides that I'm done from time to time. So, anyway, I think that they have to be in the right mindset. I mean, it sounds like the individual you tried to coach probably wasn't receptive or in a place that they were ready to be coached or ready to think about it differently, right? And so maybe, the response to that is, well, go wallow in it for a little bit longer, right? And get to a place where you're done wallowing in it. And then you've got to want to get yourself to the other side of it too, right? You can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, I think if you can just on a piece of paper write down what's happening and what you can do about it or what you can't do about it, and make it more objective, try and take the emotion out of yourself, is what I advise people to do, right? Try and take, and I know that's hard. I'm not, I'm not naive and not knowing that, but most adults do have the capability of regulating their emotions, right? And so I think it's just getting yourself to a place where you're helping regulate your emotions and understanding what you can control and what you can't control and what you can influence. And you don't have anything to lose, right? You do have something to lose potentially by being disruptive or not performing well or having bad behavior.
Well, and I think the challenge for some people is their process. If you're not careful, about how your process expresses itself, you can ultimately come to arrive at a point where, all right, you've adjusted your mindset, you've accepted the reality of what is, and now you're going to focus on what you can do as opposed to what you can't or can't control. You're going to focus. But if in that process you've created damage, if you've been circling around and moaning and complaining and backstabbing and back channeling, and you can reach a point where, okay, good on you, you've arrived at a better place, but you've actually damaged yourself longer term in the organization. So I think helping people recognize that the sooner, or the shorter their response curve can be, the better off they're going to be. And that's probably a learned skill, or it's a muscle that you build over time. it's probably helpful, if you work in an organization like GE where there's lots of ongoing change, you build that muscle. Where I think people often experience the greatest challenges is when an organization has been steady state for 10 years, for 20 years, and then suddenly big changes are occurring. People haven't had to build that muscle over time.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
One of the ways I heard this described was the individuals who operate with a high degree of mental resilience tend to, whatever occurs to them, they tend to look at it as not permanent. Whatever it is temporary. Whatever it is limited in scope. It's just the thing. It doesn't mean everything. It's just the thing. So a change in organizational structure is just that. It's a change in organizational structure. It doesn't mean this and this and this. It just means its own thing. And almost always it's not personal. There are probably exceptions, but rarely does an organization come together to conspire against a person or a small group of people. Generally speaking, and maybe that's in its own way very uncomfortable to think it's not about me. It's not personal. It's just what's happening. But if you can adopt that temporary, not personal, limited scope mindset, it tends to depersonalize it and make it easier to navigate those emotional waters. Whereas I do see this a lot where individuals will say, well, whatever this bad thing is, it's now bad forever, or it's now challenging forever, or difficult forever. And it means far more than just the change in structure, or just the change in marketing plan, or just the change in business focus. It means much bigger things. It means they're stupid. It means they're unethical. It means like big stuff. You create a big picture out of what's actually a little picture, and also it's disrespectful to me, or they're not paying attention to the little guy, or in some other way. We have ways of making these things personal, and if you turn it into permanent, pervasive, and personal, it's going to break you. I mean, you will ultimately perhaps feel good about being the victim, but it's not going to be a successful outcome. And so one of the ways I've learned to crack myself out of a victim mindset is just through the reframing, just taking your current thinking and reframing it. So I've got some examples here of reframing from failure. This is probably the biggest one for me ever. Was I've had more than my share of failures throughout life, and luckily early on somebody helped me understand that you generally don't learn from success. Success is great, success is fun, success is fantastic, but generally you don't grow from success, you don't learn from success. Where you learn is when you drop down and make a big old error in some way, shape, or form. And so as I was able to start reframing big failures as big learning opportunities, as big growth experiences, and I think it's not just Tony Robbins thinking. It's actually true. You do tend to grow much more from the big errors and mistakes than from the things that you did that worked out really well. Any thoughts on reframing that occur to either one of you?
Yeah, so I mean, just as an example, I'll use myself, right? My first leadership role in HR, it was a director of staffing. We didn't even call it talent acquisition then, so that ought to tell you when I started. It was a director of staffing, and it was the first leadership role in HR that I'd had, running a department. And I wanted to get it right. I wanted all the metrics to be right. I wanted to know where I was advertising and what was my return on investment for that advertisement. And I remember my leader at the time saying, Melissa, you are going to make mistakes. Make them quickly and don't make them twice. Right? And so it kind of, for me, helped me understand that sometimes you've got to have, you need data, you need information, but sometimes you just got to have good enough, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be every single nuance and every single detail. And that helped me kind of reframe how I was thinking about my role. And because it was not going to be perfect, I was going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, right? And it's just facing into that mistake and going, okay, now I know not to do it that way, right? And give yourself the grace that you would give someone else is the other thing I would say, because we have a tendency to beat ourselves up, which is just not going to help your self-esteem. It's going to, your own self-confidence. If you beat yourself up, it can get worn down, and you wouldn't do that to someone else, most likely. So you shouldn't do it to yourself.
I did have a conversation with someone, this again goes back a decade or so, where she'd been laid off along with a few people, and clearly most of us who were still in the business didn't feel that she should have been laid off. I mean, there was a fair amount of second guessing internally within the business, but it happened. It happened, and so she was laid off. And I had lunch with her, and she was lamenting about, why me and not that person? Why me and not that person? Why me and not this other person? Why? And she was relitigating all of the the various things that had happened. And I remember we sort of talked it through enough where I felt like we were getting all of the anger out on the table and maybe deflating some of that. But I did say to her, okay, so what do you have right now? Because you're not going to change any of that. You may be right, you may be wrong, doesn't really matter. What do you have right now that you can leverage? And she, we began discussing that, and I said, one of the things I think you're underplaying is, a lot of us who are still in the business probably feel similar to you. We feel a little bit of guilt. We feel a little bit of like, oh man, shouldn't have happened to this person. So how about leveraging that? How about reaching out and asking us for referrals, references, recommendations? Right now, you're in a place where there are a lot of people who really like you and like working with you, and we will go above and beyond to try to help you. But I guarantee you, it's not going to happen if you have lunch with each of us and spend 60 minutes relitigating. Then it's just going to be an uncomfortable lunch, and my food's not going to digest, and I'm probably not going to want to repeat it. But if instead you just shift into, all right, I'm moving forward, is there anything you can do to help? Lots of people will want to help you. And that only came from really thinking through, all right, the past is done, I got to move forward. What do I have right now that I can leverage in moving forward? So I'm going to move past this pretty quickly, but this is just a big lesson that someone shared with me years ago. And essentially he said, look, you're going to recover. The only thing in question is this a 6-minute recovery or a 6-year recovery? One, you are going to recover. And if it's a 6-year recovery, you are going to regret it. 6 years from now, you're going to go, man, why couldn't I have done that faster? So what would it take for it to be a 6-minute recovery versus six years? And that thing alone said to at least I said to myself, okay, yeah, I am going to recover. I am going to get better. Things are going to be okay. And yeah, I prefer 6 minutes. So what does that really take? Just asking that question alone became its own answer. So any thoughts that you have, or any experiences you have on employees who really got in their own way, who really couldn't